What's the most disturbing secret in your family? Story 1. One of my uncles died as a baby at the age of 1 during the 1960s. Everyone knows that he was left in the bath when my grandmother went to answer the phone, and she came back to find that the water was too hot and he had burned alive in the bathtub. It turns out my grandmother, who already had 2 children and probably would not have made a rookie mistake like that, had sent my aunt, who was 4 years old, and my other uncle, who was 3, to take a nap and was across the house on the phone. So she did not hear them start the water to give my youngest uncle a bath. They were playing bath time and accidentally burned him alive in the bathtub, and neither of them knows the truth or remembers it. My grandmother will not tell them because she does not want them to blame themselves. I am not sure why my mother knows, but she told me during a deep conversation over family issues. Story 2. Any trace of my family's history photos, records, heirlooms, property, and so on was wiped away by Pol Pot's regime. Anything left, like a few family photos and necklaces, was smuggled by each person who valued it. 80% of my family do not actually have memories of their birthdays, as many of them were adolescents surviving the years of the killing fields. So 80% of my family do not actually know how old they are. Everything I know of my parents, uncles and aunts, and grandparents before the war are only anecdotal recollections. With only one surviving grandparent, it is hard to piece together a complete story. My siblings and I will literally be the only generation with a recorded existence in my family. Story 3. The first person in my family to immigrate to America was granted an enormous amount of land to help settle and lead a town in Virginia. 31 years later, he testified against his 2 eldest sons for skipping church 3 Sundays in a row. They were fined 100 acres of tobacco each. 2 weeks later, he threw the first stone in a public stoning that resulted in their deaths. They had been convicted of devil worship after skipping church 5 Sundays straight. He was then forced to resign from all public offices he held. The following Sunday, while everyone was in church, he and his only remaining son burned down every building in the town except for the church. They fled and set fire to every tobacco field that had been forfeited on their way to Texas. They changed the spelling of our last name when they settled there. The only reason we know this happened is because census records show both of them mysteriously appearing in a Texas town with an almost identical name. They simply changed the spelling to a phonetic version. They did not bother lying about their ages or origins. The surviving son had only 1 child that lived past birth. That son became a bank robber in his late 60s to pay for his children to attend law school. Somehow our family is known for famous lawyers and not the first 3 generations of criminals in America. Story 4. Not related to me, but there is a woman over 90 years old from Germany who is friends with my grandmother and has lived across from her for years. When I had to write a thesis paper, I asked her if she was willing to share a part of her story for my research. She took a few days to answer, but agreed on the condition that her grandchildren would be allowed to read the interview when they turned 18. She was barely 17 years old when the war began, and her entire family except for her mother was male 2 brothers and her father, so they were all eventually conscripted into the service. None of them survived past 1944. In early 1943, an Allied bomb exploded next to their house in Hamburg, and she broke her back. Immobilized for 13 months in a full-body cast, she relearned to walk just in time for the Eastern Front to reach the hospital she had been transferred to. She did not say it happened to her, but she described how Russian soldiers entered, killed all the men and boys, and raped many of the women. A Russian machine gunner killed all the babies in the maternity ward, and for good measure they burned the hospital down, leaving many still inside to burn alive. She said she still remembers one Red Army soldier laughing as he walked by, remarking that the forward detachments had left nothing for them to shoot. "The sound never leaves me," she told me. Still very weak from her injuries and not knowing where her family was, she was left to fend for herself from 1945 until late 1946. She spoke of checking the pockets of dead bodies for scraps of food or foreign currency, eating things I could not imagine eating. In early 1946, she got in touch with the American Army, which accessed surviving records for German citizens. There she learned that the Nazis had listed her entire family as deceased, so she went to Berlin to try to get residence on the American side of the city, and find work. Her description of Germany during that trip was like something out of The Road. There were barely any buildings not bombed, burned, or shot up. Bodies lay everywhere, and she endured constant abuse because of her blonde hair. Seen as the symbol of Hitler's Germany, she said people threw rocks at her, called her a dog, and told her to die in a ditch. She alluded to Seoul assault but did not go into detail, though her eyes said it all. I did not have the courage to ask her about the concentration camps. Working in Berlin in 1946 at a tailor shop, the owner yelled at her to go to the counter to help a customer. He was an alcoholic former soldier, abusive and bitter from the war. When she walked to the counter, she thought another bomb had fallen and killed her because she was staring at a ghost. At the counter, reported dead for months, was her mother. She said no moment in her life ever compared to the happiness she felt then, believing God had sent her mother back to her. I am not religious, but I cannot explain that. It truly felt like a miracle. They both received immigration exemptions because they had relatives in the United States. She told me the biggest shock was boarding a ship in England and realizing how the Germans had bombed and killed just as brutally as the Allies. Living in Nazi Germany, many citizens were never told the truth, and she had thought only the Allies bombed civilians. She never understood the full impact of the war until then. I saw the same hopelessness, despair, and destruction in England that I did in Germany. If people had been able to see each other during the war, it would not have lasted a day. Our only difference was language. British, French, German, we all suffered as equals. Children were the worst. Their eyes showed a lifetime of suffering. I did that interview nearly 4 years ago and have never looked at things the same way. I barely knew this woman as a 21-year-old student, but we hugged and cried, wrote letters back and forth until her arthritis became too painful. War is hell, war is pointless, and the ends almost never justify the means. The Holocaust compounds the tragedy of the Second World War, but truly all war does is force everyone into unimaginable horror. There is never a truly good reason to fight one. It taught me that history is one of the most important things to learn. We repeat so many mistakes as a society that we could avoid by understanding what others have endured. I make an effort to know my neighbors now. I think about people differently. What story does your boss, your neighbor, your coworker have that could completely redefine your understanding of them? That little old lady might not just be a cranky woman who lives across from your grandmother. She may be a warrior at heart. She has 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren now. She told me her life has never been better, even though she has respiratory problems from the chemicals present during the war. I have not spoken to her much since she moved to Texas with her family, but I wish her well every day and was lucky enough to talk to her on Thanksgiving. I hope you find peace, Anna. Story 5. My grandfather told me stories about his time as a prisoner in Germany. He was a soldier after the Italian campaign in Greece and was taken prisoner by the Germans after Italy signed the armistice with the Allies. I believe he was there as part of the occupation forces, which made him an enemy of Germany after the armistice. He was taken somewhere to Poland, to a labor camp. Most of the prisoners were soldiers like him. It was not meant to be an extermination camp, though many still died from starvation, illness, extreme fatigue, and other causes. My grandfather said that one time, 1 out of 5 doctors saved his life by touching his ankles and telling the others that he was still good for work. The only words he understood were Arbeit gut, which he believed meant fit for work, even though he was extremely weak. He told us more about his journey back home than about his time in the camp. I think he wanted to keep the worst things to himself. After returning, he was so traumatized that he decided he would let himself die, lying in bed for days without eating until his caring sisters and mother convinced him otherwise. He spent years without speaking about the war. My father and uncles knew very little about that experience. About 50 years later, when I was a child, he began to share small pieces of what had happened. He died peacefully in his bed last April. His mind deteriorated rapidly in his final months, and during that time, he often woke up in panic, saying he saw soldiers everywhere and people marching. That experience left a scar that haunted him until his last days. Story 6. My mother's uncle lived modestly in a trailer and had no steady job. only taking on occasional manual labor work. He would routinely fall behind on bills and often had his water and utilities cut off or threatened to be cut off. On several occasions, he disappeared to a large city about 3 hours north of his home for a few days. Every time he came back, he had a large amount of cash. One night during a poker game, people started talking trash, and he said that none of them knew what it was like to kill a man. One of the people there was my mother's cousin, who later claimed to have overheard the conversation. Naturally, they pressed him for more details, but he refused to say anything else. Everyone in the family knew he had a mysterious way of coming into large sums of money, but no one ever knew how, other than assuming he was gambling. He died about 10 years ago. I am 37, and I just heard this story for the first time during Thanksgiving dinner last week. Story 7. My grandfather managed to get his wife and 3 children out of Europe just before the Nazis invaded their country. The rest of that side of my family, every one of them, stayed behind and were killed in concentration camps. Decades later, after my grandparents had died, and even their children were old, we discovered a trove of letters, dozens of them. They were from those family members responding to my grandfather's repeated pleas for them to leave as well. Each one expressed complete certainty that they would be fine and seemed to suggest that my grandfather was being an alarmist. So many letters from so many people he tried to save, all refusing to listen. I never met my grandfather because he died of a mysterious condition soon after emigrating. Now that I think about it, considering those letters and his desperate attempts to save his family, I believe he died of a broken heart. Story 8. My grandfather served 40 total months in Vietnam. He had 2 daughters and never felt comfortable opening up to them. He never spoke to his wife or therapist about his experiences because he did not think anyone would understand. When I joined the Army, he decided I was the one he could talk to. He told me many stories, but one stands out the most. He said they were on a 3-week patrol near the border of Cambodia, close to the 17th parallel. Before heading out, he talked to a platoon that had run a similar route. They warned him that the local Viet Cong would sometimes send children out with gifts for the American soldiers and hide grenades in soda cans to kill a few of them. My grandfather said that one day during the patrol, they stopped to check their map when a group of local children approached. He saw a little girl holding a soda can. He yelled at her to stop. His squad shouted for her to stop too, all pointing their weapons and telling her to stay back. My grandfather fired a burst at the ground in front of her to scare her, but she kept coming. Finally, he decided it was time and emptied his magazine. It turned out to be just a regular soda can. That was not the most horrifying story he ever told me, but it was the darkest one I'm willing to share. At first, I tried writing down everything he said, but eventually I realized those memories should leave this world with him. Story 9. There are objectively worse things in my family's history, but the most chilling was learning how my grandfather abused animals. He was seen as a real pillar of the community, a well-to-do man with a stable home life and a responsible husband. For a while, they lived in a house that could be called a country estate, and that large property came with a cat when they bought it. She was a barn cat, a mouser. Long after they had sold the property, my mother and grandmother were reminiscing about the place, remembered the cat, and wondered what had happened to her kittens. Smiling, he joined the conversation, saying, "I asphyxiated them." Then he described how he bundled each litter of kittens into a bag, tied it to the car exhaust, and let the car idle until they stopped moving. Afterward, he buried them out back. Instead of ever getting the cat spayed, he let her keep having litters and executed every one of them. He never tried to find homes for the kittens or take them to a shelter. Cost was no issue. This man had a country club membership and owned a yacht. Yet he was the kind of man who was polite to waiters and a doting, loyal husband. My grandmother passed away when I was 19, and the only argument I ever saw between them lasted less than 5 seconds. No one suspected he was capable of such cruelty, not even his wife. When he finally admitted it, no one treated it as if it mattered. I was a teenager in the same room during that conversation, listening in stunned silence, and I did not know what to think about it for a long time afterward. Story 10. My maternal great-grandparents, Sarah and Levi, had twins, a girl and a boy. My grandfather, Harrison, was their older brother. When I was working on my genealogy, I discovered that the twins both died on the same day. Nobody in my family is sure why or how. Harrison never spoke about it, but the rumor was that they might have suffocated accidentally. My mother recalled hearing that they had been placed on an open oven door to keep warm, which was apparently a common thing to do in the 1920s or 30s, and that someone accidentally closed the oven door, pushing the twins inside. Nobody knows the truth. Levi worked for a carnation milk factory in the 1930s or 40s and was involved in an accident where a piece of machinery hit him hard in the head. He was sent home, lay down for a nap, and never woke up again, likely from a fatal concussion. Harrison had to drop out of school as a teenager to support the family. Then, in the 1960s, Harrison was in a hospital waiting room complaining of chest pain when he suddenly collapsed. It was discovered that he had a heart aneurysm. Back then, it was considered fatal, but there happened to be some students fresh out of medical school at that hospital who had just learned about a new surgical technique for aneurysms. They could not guarantee he would survive the surgery, and even if he did, they did not know how long he might live afterward. It was purely experimental at that point, but my grandmother gave her consent and they performed it. He ended up living for many more years until he died in 1988, when I was 2, from liver cancer that he refused to have treated. I was told it was because he had seen his sister die from cancer and did not want to suffer trying to fight a losing battle. My grandfather Harrison had a hard life, but he was deeply loved and missed by my family. My grandmother, his wife, finally rejoined him in 2012. Story 11. My father did not know that the woman he had been living with was his stepmother and not his biological mother until he was in his 20s. What happened was that my grandparents divorced around the time my father was about 3 years old. Around that same time, he was hospitalized with third-degree burns after accidentally spilling a pot of boiling water. When he came home, there was a different woman in the house. At first, he insisted that she was not his mother, but everyone, his father, aunts, and sisters, kept telling him she was. Being a little kid, he eventually accepted it and forgot. Their intention was to give him as normal a childhood as possible, since divorce was highly stigmatized in their culture at the time. Needless to say, my father was shocked when he discovered the truth while preparing his visa to study in the United States. The most disturbing part was that all his friends already knew. It was common knowledge in the neighborhood, but no one ever mentioned it to him, assuming he already knew. He also found out that his older sisters had been secretly visiting their biological mother almost every week, hiding it from him all those years. Story 12. My mother-in-law's parents were most likely involved with the Southern mob during the 1950s, and her father was murdered when she was 6 years old because of it. She does not talk about it much, and her mother passed away fairly young in a car accident, so we do not know many details. The story goes that her father was shot while walking home. A day or two later, 2 men in suits arrived and told her mother that if she wanted to see her little girls grow up, she needed to take them and get as far away as possible. Her mother packed only what was necessary, gathered a pile of papers. No one knows what was on them, as my mother-in-law was only 6 and set them on fire in the center of the house. After that, they spent years moving across the western states, never staying in one place for too long until they finally settled in Illinois, where my mother-in-law met my father-in-law at 16 years old and became pregnant. Her mother refused to ever speak about her late husband, out of fear, and died suddenly in a car accident about 10 years later. There are not many relatives left from that side of the family, so I doubt we will ever truly know what happened. Story 13. One side of my father's family often jokes about how dysfunctional they are. At a funeral about 10 years ago, one of his cousins, R, said this to me. I pointed him toward a scene across the room, 2 clearly connected family groups sitting apart, with visible tension and discomfort, and explained why. My father's second cousin, from the opposite side of R's family, had been married for 20 years with 2 children, seemingly happy. Then she discovered her husband was having an affair with her niece, who looked almost identical to her, just 20 years younger. The husband left his wife and moved in with the niece. They later married and had 2 more children. That made the 4 children both siblings and cousins once removed. The aunt and niece no longer spoke, nor did the original wife and her sister, who had supported her daughter's affair and marriage to her uncle, even if he was only an uncle by marriage. I told R that this was proof there were families far more dysfunctional than his. But 10 years later, R's own younger brother D died by suicide after being unable to overcome his substance addiction. R had always been far too judgmental toward him, in my opinion. And in one final twist of family dysfunction, guess who is now serving a prison sentence for downloading child pornography? That's right, it's RD may have struggled with addiction, but at least he was not finding pleasure in the suffering of children. R was right about one thing, though. His side of the family turned out to be the most disturbed of all. Story 14. This is not technically about my family, but rather about my family's property. My grandmother's old land where I now live has been in my family for almost 100 years. In the 1880s, a Christian cult leader lived on this property with his wife and 2 daughters. He came to believe that he was the incarnation of the Archangel Michael and that Jesus wanted him to sacrifice one of his daughters. One day, he stabbed her in the chest on the kitchen table. Afterward, he called the rest of the cult members to witness what he had done, and most of them were horrified. The sheriff rode down on horseback and arrested him and his wife. We are still trying to uncover the full story, but we know bits and pieces. The house I live in now was originally one of their barns. The cult supposedly burned down the main house, but we still find remnants like charred bricks, melted glass, rusty cutlery, pieces of porcelain, and barrel bands buried around the property. Story 15. This disturbing event in my family's history splits into 2 parts. Before I was born, and about 5 or 6 years ago, my great-uncle was a hero addict from the time my mother was 7 until she was 27. 20 difficult years. Before he got clean, he was broke, living on the streets, and used any needle he could find to shoot up. Fast forward to about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was around 12. By then, he had been sober for 14 years. I would visit him every couple of months, but each time he looked thinner. Within a year, he went from a healthy 180 pounds, about 82 kilograms, to a frail 68 pounds, roughly 31 kilograms. One day I went to his townhouse and something felt off. When I saw him, he looked worse than ever. His eyes, cheeks, and temples sunken into his skull, his elbows sharp, his fingers skeletal, and his knees like baseballs attached to bony legs. His smile was still radiant, but filled with pain. Something told me it would be the last time I saw him. The next week, my mother told me he had passed away. It turned out he had hepatitis C and had been suffering for a long time, much longer than the year he lost most of his body mass. Doctors believed he had contracted it from one of the dirty needles he used during his addiction. As disturbing as addiction can be, we must remember that those suffering from it often need more help and compassion than we can give. Story 16. I am a Native American living in rural Canada, and almost every other Indigenous person I know carries an extremely dark past. The grandparents from both sides of my family are residential school survivors. I have heard horrifying stories of extreme alcoholism and domestic violence, like my grandfather dragging my grandmother by her hair outside the car door while driving full speed down the road. My father is a recovering alcoholic who was extremely abusive, and my parents used to get drunk and fight, hitting each other with the car and chasing one another around with knives. All of my uncles and aunts are the same way. All of my cousins struggle with psychological issues, and we share horror stories of our parents' violence. It feels like a never-ending cycle in my family, and I hope to be the first to break it, though I still suffer from mental illness because of the trauma. Residential schools and cultural genocide are no joke, and anyone who says to just get over it is completely inhuman. Story 17. The most disturbing thing in my family's recent history was learning that my grandparents supposedly had only one child, my father, when in truth, they had another son before him. I found out several years ago and eventually learned the full story. Back in the early 1970s, my grandfather was an alcoholic. While he was a good man when sober, he became violent and cruel when drunk, regularly beating my grandmother. When she became pregnant, he stopped hitting her for a while, but one night, when she was about 7 months along, he came home extremely drunk and angry. Whatever he did that night, she could barely speak through the memory. It caused her to go into premature labor from the trauma. He would not let her leave or use the phone. She eventually passed out, and when she woke, her body had already done what it was designed to do. Only then did he allow her to call for help, but it was too late. My uncle had died before they reached the hospital. No one except them and her mother knew the truth until she told me. He does not even have a grave. The policy at the time was to incinerate the body of a premature fetus as medical waste. But my great-grandmother, who worked at the hospital as a nurse, managed to recover his remains. She buried him at the foot of her own father's grave. The only person my grandmother felt would never be angry with her for what happened. Grief is a strange thing, and though it does not all make sense, it was her way of finding peace. So yes, I have an uncle that only I know about now. Story 18. My grandmother was a preteen when she escaped Ukraine during the Second World War. Only she and her mother made it out alive. She watched her father get shot, and her brother disappeared one day when he went for a horseback ride, likely captured and killed. When they arrived in England, my grandmother was 16. One of the refugee camp officers fell in love with her and blackmailed her into marrying him, threatening to send her mother to Siberia if she refused. They married and he beat her savagely every day. Once he hit her so hard that she lost a few teeth and had to go to the dentist downstairs from her apartment. Later, they immigrated to Canada, and through the help of a lawyer friend, she finally managed to escape him. She traveled from Edmonton to Toronto, where she met my grandfather and fell in love. Her abusive husband spent years searching for her. She married my grandfather, never legally divorced, and had my father and aunt. She wrote a book about roughly half of this story, leaving out the abuse, which was later published by a small Ukrainian company. The rest only I know. Story 19. This one is not exactly about my family, but about my stepfather's family. His brother married a kind woman but started sleeping with her sister. One day his pregnant wife had an accident, and both she and her unborn child died. A few months later, he married his sister-in-law. Considering that his family is very religious and believes widows and widowers should never remarry, that marriage happens only once, their complete denial of the first wife's existence is astounding. They treat the new couple as if they are the kindest, most perfect people on earth. When their mother became too old to care for herself, they decided to hire someone to live with her and help around the house. He refused to let anyone else handle the hiring and personally chose a Cuban woman. Their mother did not like her and said she was stealing from her, suffering from panic attacks every day. When someone suggested finding another caregiver, or even considering a retirement home, since the situation was unbearable, he exploded in anger. Of course, he did not want to fire her because he was having an affair with her, so she stayed, and their mother continued living in fear. Meanwhile, he managed his mother's finances, which really meant he was stealing from her weekly. No one said a word because that would mean admitting the family was not perfect, and they could not allow that. He has always been self-righteous, obsessed with proving he is smarter than everyone else, and it was no surprise when he and his wife, his former sister-in-law, joined a strange cult. They even claimed they would move to a South American country to serve their leader after retirement. Eventually, karma caught up with him. He got cancer in its early stages, but because they did not believe in doctors, he refused treatment, claiming doctors were murderers. Instead, he went to a shaman who told him it was just indigestion. He cut out so-called poisonous foods like potatoes, tomatoes, meat, dairy, and several other fruits and vegetables, believing he would be cured. 2 years later, he looked like a walking corpse, but still insisted he was fine. When transferred to a smaller hospital, the one people call the place where everyone goes to die, he and his wife were thrilled, thinking the garden there would heal him faster. The day before he died, he was still insulting his siblings for bringing him disgusting food and calling them useless. Even on the day he died, no one was allowed to admit he had cancer. It was still just indigestion, soon to be cured by climbing mountains. Over a year has passed since his death, and I still cannot openly say he had cancer and refused treatment, because that would mean admitting the family was never perfect, and that truth is something they will never face. Story 20. My great-aunt was married to a drunk. She thought she had reformed him, and for a while she had, but anyone can relapse. When he lost his job and started drinking again, she knew she had to leave. One day she left work early, picked up her children, and packed their bags. Before leaving, she sent her youngest son to take out the trash one last time. which for some reason involved driving a few miles down the road to the dump. While she was gathering some last-minute belongings, John, her husband, came home. He was drunk and furious. He walked into the house carrying a .38 caliber revolver and shot his wife and 2 daughters. The youngest, Dolly June, was hit once in the stomach but pretended to be dead. After shooting the women, John's son returned and tried to help his mother, only to be shot and killed as well. John dragged all of their bodies one by one into the kitchen and left them there. Later, Dolly was found alive, the only survivor. My grandfather received the devastating news in Charlotte, North Carolina, and immediately left for Knoxville, Tennessee, taking my 15-year-old father and 2-year-old uncle with him. Authorities knew he intended to kill John, so they stopped him at the state line. They searched his car but found nothing. His pistol had been tucked away in my uncle's diaper. The police let him go but radioed ahead to ensure that John was put in prison for his own safety. I might not even be here if my grandfather had been arrested that day. Story 21. My great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, was killed a few months before she was born. It was reportedly murder, committed by his own brother, who had gotten involved in bootlegging. My great-grandfather had chosen more legitimate work, possibly in coal or steel, I am not sure which. One day his brother came to borrow his truck, but knowing his brother's criminal ties, he refused repeatedly. Not long after, my great-grandfather and a neighbor he carpooled with finished work to find the truck missing. With no other option, they began walking home along a road that is now one of the main highways out of the city. As they walked, a speeding vehicle struck my great-grandfather, who was closest to the road, killing him instantly. The neighbor survived and ran for help, but by the time anyone arrived, it was too late. Sometime later, at a family gathering, my great-great-grandmother was there, along with the brother suspected of the murder. He was sitting on the second-floor balcony, leaning against the railing, talking to relatives. When she passed by without greeting him, he called out, asking why she had ignored him. She shouted back that she had no son and that he had killed him, before pushing him backward off the balcony. He survived the fall without injury, but I imagine it ruined the rest of the party. Story 22. From around 1890 to 1920, my great-great-grandparents lived on a farm along the Ohio River in southern Indiana, directly across from Louisville. They lived in separate houses on the property, divided by a creek. My great-great-grandfather was a spiritual medium who held seances and was known throughout Clark County for his supposed ability to contact the dead. He claimed to speak with the spirits of Native Americans buried on the land part of the property, later proved to be an actual burial ground. He also believed in the legend of Prince Madoc of Wales, who supposedly sailed to America long before Columbus. According to him, Madoc and his followers settled in the Ohio River Valley, where they clashed violently with the Shawnee. My great-great-grandmother, who was half Shawnee, told a local historian that her family passed down a story about a curse placed on the Shawnee by those settlers. Their daughter, my great-grandmother, worked as a housekeeper for a young widower who owned a grocery store. She became pregnant by him, and they later married. After he died, she began suffering from seizures, claimed to see ghosts, and grew terrified of being alone. She was declared legally insane and committed to the Central Hospital for the Insane in Indianapolis. Her daughters, including my grandmother, were sent to live with their grandmother. A few years later, my great-great-grandfather was walking along the railroad tracks from Louisville to Jeffersonville to visit a woman when a train hit him from behind, killing him instantly. Not long after, my great-great-grandmother was beaten to death by her 19-year-old grandson, who shared her house along with my grandmother and nearly a dozen other relatives. She managed the family's finances and kept money locked in a dresser drawer, wearing the key on a chain around her neck. One day, the grandson tried to smash open the dresser, then beat her with a crowbar when she resisted. Her body was found that evening, naked and wrapped in a bloody quilt. The money was gone. Police searched through the night and found him the next morning camping by the river. As they approached, he drank a bottle of carbolic acid and died instantly. It made front-page news for days. Some relatives believed he was innocent and that his father, an alcoholic with a violent temper, had framed him. That same father had once tried to throw his brother under a moving train. They thought his story about attending a baseball game alone that day was suspicious. A few years later, my great-grandmother died alone in the asylum. Her body was brought home and buried with the family. My grandmother ran away to Louisville soon after to work as domestic help for a wealthy pharmacist's family. They taught her manners, grammar, and household skills and inspired her love for reading. When my mother was young, my grandmother told her that her parents had died of illness and that a family friend had arranged for her to work in Louisville. She never revealed the truth. My mother and her sister only discovered it decades later when my father uncovered the real story during genealogy research. They were both in their 70s by then. Story 23. My paternal great-grandfather on my father's side was a Grand Dragon in the Ku Klux Klan, and one of my great-uncles on my father's mother's side still has the robe he was supposed to be initiated with. On my mother's side, my grandfather witnessed his own father's murder. My great-grandfather had been very outspoken against the Communist Party trying to take over Greece and got into an argument with an equally vocal supporter. The next day, when my grandfather went into town with his father to run errands, the man walked right up to my great-grandfather, shot him in the head, and calmly walked away. The police did nothing, and the murder traumatized my grandfather for the rest of his life. The final dark story also comes from my mother's side of the family. My maternal grandmother lost her mother at a very young age. She died in childbirth, along with the baby. That left my great-grandfather with 5 children and no one to care for them while he worked to provide for the family. Out of desperation, he married a harsh young woman who had been considered a spinster, hoping she would take care of the children and manage the home. Unfortunately, she turned out to be monstrously abusive, especially toward my grandmother, the only girl in the family. She tortured her both physically and emotionally for years, even into adulthood, until one day she beat her so severely that she could no longer hide it. When my grandfather found out, he made it very clear that if anyone ever hurt his wife again, there would be consequences. Story 24. My grandparents had 4 children, but for most of my life, everyone only knew about my mother and my 2 uncles. When I was 17, my grandmother finally broke down and told my mother the truth. She had a sister they had given up for adoption before moving away. My grandfather had insisted they could not afford another child, and rather than face the shame of explaining a missing baby to friends, family, and their 2 children at the time, they made up a lie. One day when my uncle was running through the kitchen, he accidentally bumped into my grandmother while she was near the end of her pregnancy. They used that incident as an excuse, telling everyone the baby had been stillborn because of it. Years later, my mother managed to track down her sister, and the resemblance between them was uncanny. When we met her, she was kind, understanding, and held no grudge against my grandmother. She became part of the family right away. My uncle, the one who had been told his accident had caused the baby's death, is still angry. He carried that guilt for decades, believing he had killed his sister, and even though my grandfather has passed, he still struggles to forgive my grandmother for letting him live with that lie. Story 25. My parents were never married, just together for a brief period. My mother was mostly infertile, so it took 7 tries for her to have me. In Texas, common law now recognizes that they are married because they had a child together, even though they despise each other. My mother only wanted my father as a sperm donor, and my father wanted, well, I'm still not sure what. Either way, they both wanted me, or at least wanted me away from the other. Their relationship was pure chaos and at times lethal. My father kidnapped me once when I was 2, taking me from my babysitter in Oklahoma. My mother later staged what she called a counter-kidnap during a tornado, which, while insane, is one of her most metal stories. The 3rd time my father used the courts, he manipulated me with his dungeon master storytelling skills, convincing me that my mother had assaulted me. I testified in court using the exact phrase, "She touched me in my no-no spots." It backfired horribly. Both parents were deemed unfit, and I was placed in Texas foster care. The foster system there is a nightmare. All my belongings were sold except for a special quilt I still sleep with to this day. They placed me with violent felon teens, but luckily I learned to stay out of their way. My mother gave up hope, but my father, ex-military and reckless, broke me out by force. He grabbed what little I owned, and we fled the state. It was officially kidnapping, and Texas was furious. But honestly, I'm glad he did it, because the next foster home lined up for me was with substance addicts. We planned to reach California but ended up in Arizona instead. For 4 years, life was oddly peaceful. My father introduced me to PC gaming, Dungeons and Dragons, and a semi-stable routine. We had no car, so we walked everywhere, sometimes 10 miles with $400 worth of groceries in the heat. It was miserable but memorable. Then one Christmas, my father said he was giving me the best gift ever, no presents, just something better. That evening, a car pulled up to our apartment, and out stepped my mother, holding the hand of a little girl I didn't know existed. My sister. I was 11 years older than her. My mother had gotten involved with another man and believed having a baby would make him stay, but he left anyway. My parents had somehow agreed to a week-long visit, something terrifying, given they never agreed on anything. And yet, for that week, things were peaceful. They were civil. I bonded with my sister, but the day before she was supposed to leave, her employer committed suicide, leaving my mother stranded and desperate. Over time, tension built up again, leading to violent fights. I even ran away once, walking 20 miles before the Phoenix police found me in Mesa. They claimed they had 20 officers searching for me, though I doubt it. By the 4th of July, things exploded. My father was arrested after another violent fight, and my mother, sister, and I were evicted. We moved to Oregon, where her terrible taste in men struck again, twice. The first one involved accusations of molestation while I was away. The second, a man named Gene, I caught beating my mother. He came at me first, but I fought back and left him with a severe concussion that required staples in his head and neck. 2 weeks later, the Department of Human Services intervened. Now, 2 years later, I am still in the foster system, trying to figure out how to move forward from a life that never stopped spinning out of control. Story 26. My maternal grandparents simply did not want to be a family. My grandfather had several children with my grandmother, but when the youngest was about 5, he walked out and never came back. The children only saw him once more, about 15 years later. My grandmother was an alcoholic before he left, after he left, and for decades after that. She would constantly say she was going to the store, only to come home hours later completely drunk and with no groceries. Sometimes she would vanish for days, leaving her pre-teen and teenage children to fend for themselves. Once my mom and her siblings came home from school to find their house completely empty. No furniture, no clothes, nothing. They called neighbors and eventually the police, who found my grandmother hours later. She had moved across town and forgotten to tell her kids. Years later, the children tracked down their father and pulled into his driveway after months of searching. When they announced who they were, he stepped back into the house, and his new wife came out with a rifle and started shooting at them. The next time they saw him was at his funeral a year and a half later. My grandmother never stopped drinking. It defined her life and my memories of her. As a kid in the early 1980s, I remember riding with her along the Gulf Coast as she sipped from a highball glass filled with whatever liquor she needed to get through the day. Story 27. My parents escaped a genocide, but that's not even the most disturbing part. Before they fled, my father worked with the Red Cross, helping rural villages in his country. He was captured by the Viet Cong and imprisoned in a labor camp for a long time. He told me how he buried people every day, earning the guards' trust until they put him in charge of caring for the sick. He secretly helped keep them alive by stealing fruit and fish from nearby farms. But one day, someone he knew betrayed him, revealing his escape plans. The guards were preparing to execute him. The only reason he survived was because some villagers who respected him warned him in time. They quietly asked if he was the man they'd heard the soldiers were looking for, and when he confirmed it, they helped him flee. He narrowly escaped and was hunted for some time afterward. I don't know all the details. My father told me the story only once when I was 30 during Thanksgiving. The most haunting part was when he said he no longer feared death after burying so many bodies every day. Until that conversation, I had no real understanding of what my parents had endured. I had suspected they went through trauma, but most people do not survive what my father lived through. Story 28. My grandfather's sister had an affair when she was in her 20s and became pregnant. Since she had been working in another city, there was no way to pretend the baby was her husband's. Desperate, she turned to someone who performed illegal abortions. Something went terribly wrong during the procedure. and she barely managed to return home before dying in my grandfather's arms, leaving behind two little girls. My grandfather had a soft spot for them and did everything he could to support them. One of the daughters eventually fled from an abusive husband, but when her family insisted she go back to him, she cut all contact. When my grandfather died last year, my mother was convinced she saw that same woman at the funeral, standing in the back quietly, but she disappeared again afterward. My grandfather himself was forced to fight in the German army during World War II, an act considered a war crime since he wasn't German. If he had refused or deserted, he and his family would have been sent to Germany for re-education. He was supposed to be deployed to Stalingrad, but was injured in Kiev, where a Russian doctor saved his life only to be killed by German soldiers shortly after. Later in life, tragedy struck again when one of my cousins accidentally killed a child in a hit-and-run. She went to the police the next day, explaining that she had fled because she feared the child's family would kill her on the spot. She was sentenced to prison for it and served her time, but the guilt never left her. Story 29. My great-grandfather survived the Bataan Death March when the Japanese invaded the Philippines during World War II. My father and grandfather told me how he endured starvation and exhaustion during that brutal ordeal. He would catch food thrown by locals standing along the path. His own brother was among those risking their lives to toss scraps to the prisoners. He collected rainwater in his military helmet to drink, and when he didn't need water, he would flip the helmet over, place his shirt underneath, and use it to stay warm and avoid illness. After endless days of torture and forced marching, he was finally rescued, skeletal and malnourished, but alive. Despite everything he went through, he lived a long life and became an inspiration to everyone in our family. Today, he still lives in Manila, though his age has robbed him of most of his memories and his ability to speak clearly. When my aunts and uncles were younger, they would proudly bring him to their schools so he could tell his story to their classmates. It breaks my heart that I never got the chance to talk to him myself. Story 30. My father was an alcoholic and heavily addicted to substances. He was on crack when I was born and wasn't even at the hospital because he was drunk. In 1997, the day after my third birthday, we went to a game ranch in Georgia. Both my dad and my uncle, my mom's only sibling, got drunk. Things turned violent when my uncle started calling my mom names. My dad punched him hard in the face, and my uncle dropped to his knees. The only thing I remember from that night is a paramedic blowing up a glove to make me laugh. My uncle was declared brain dead, and they took him off life support the next day, 2 days after my birthday. My dad served time for involuntary manslaughter and was released in May 2002. That November, on the 11th, I came home from school while my mom was putting groceries away. I remember telling her that night that my dad was sleeping funny, but he wasn't sleeping. She sent me to a neighbor's apartment while the paramedics worked in our home. Hours later, I saw her standing outside under the streetlight, her face wet with tears, and I knew he was gone. He had overdosed. When my mom finally found a new house, I went back into the apartment to help pack our things, but she never stepped inside again. It was as if the place itself carried every ghost of what had destroyed us. Story 31. My great-uncle used to smuggle coca from Colombia into southern Louisiana in the 1980s, flying across the bayou on an insane speedboat. He looked the part: 2 white linen suits, flashy sunglasses, slick-back hair, and a massive mansion straight out of Scarface. My dad remembered going there for Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, saying the place was nearly identical to Tony Montana's house. Eventually, my great-uncle got caught and took a plea deal, giving up everyone involved in the operation. The mansion was demolished, and he disappeared into witness protection for the rest of his life. A few weeks before my grandmother died, she admitted something that blew my mind. She had been part of the Dixie Mafia from the 1960s until the day she died. She told me how they used to smuggle weed by having Cessna planes drop bales into the swamp, which they'd retrieve with airboats. She hinted that she did other things too, but never explained what. After she passed away, my mom, cousin, and great-aunt had to contact some of her old friends to come help hide her secret grow operation. Hidden behind her property were poppy and marijuana plants. One last reminder that my sweet old grandmother had been living a double life right under everyone's nose. Story 32. My great-grandfather immigrated from Italy to Western Pennsylvania in the early 1900s. At some point, he got into a feud with another man who eventually shot him in the back. After recovering from the wound, my great-grandfather crossed paths with the shooter's brother. Not long after, that man was found dead hanged from a tree just outside of town. My great-grandfather was charged with murder, but there was a twist. His wife, my great-grandmother, worked as a housekeeper for a powerful judge in western Pennsylvania. I've seen old newspaper clippings about the case, but I can't recall whether he was acquitted or if the charges just disappeared. Either way, he walked free and immediately moved his family to Philadelphia. There they lived in a house far beyond what they could have afforded. My grandfather used to say that every Christmas, all their presents were delivered by the judge's family. Nobody ever knew why the judge's family kept supporting them so generously. Some believe my great-grandmother had leverage on them after working in their household for years. Others think there might have been an affair between her and the judge's son. They were around the same age. Supporting that theory, my great-aunt, their 13th child, was born around the time of their sudden move to Philadelphia and was immediately sent to live with relatives 20 miles south of their original hometown. Maybe she was the love child, and some kind of deal was made for the judge to look after the family in exchange for silence. Oddly enough, decades later, I ended up going to college in that same small town 20 miles south, never realizing I'd been studying so close to the root of that family secret. Story 33. In 1951, my great-grandfather, who worked as a Soviet security officer, learned that the NKVD would soon be visiting him and his family to investigate both his wife and his own alleged misconduct. Apparently, some documents had been forged to cover up either his or his wife's laziness in their administrative work. No one knows who warned him or if the threat was even real. What is known as this: on February 21, 1951, he left his home just outside Kiev and vanished. 11 days later, he surfaced off the coast of Italy, where he was granted asylum due to his position in Soviet law enforcement. Eventually, he was admitted into the United States. Since he had served as an artilleryman at the Battle of Kursk, my family believes the Americans were interested in whatever technical information he could provide about Soviet weaponry during the early Cold War. Meanwhile, back home, his wife was arrested on February 26th, accused of forging state documents and sentenced to 14 years in a gulag. 4 years later, in 1955, my great-grandfather met my great-grandmother in New York City, and from that meeting, the rest of our family began. I'll never know what he was thinking when he fled, or how he justified abandoning his wife to that fate. But if he hadn't, I wouldn't be here, and that's a truth I still don't know how to feel about. Story 34. My father built a hardware company from the ground up, turning it into a multi-million-dollar success. Then one ordinary day, everything changed when his car was rear-ended. The crash left him with permanent brain damage and more than a year in the hospital. During his recovery, his siblings stepped in to help manage the company. But while he was still disoriented, just aware enough for his signature to be legally valid, they had him sign away the business he'd worked his entire life to build. They convinced him to pour millions of his own money into supposed rescue efforts, but all they were really doing was lining their own pockets. The company eventually went under, and when my father tried to take legal action, his lawyer likely bribed or threatened, sabotaged him too, leaving him with nothing. We've managed to survive thanks to the investments he made years ago, but they're running dry. Now, in his 60s and still disabled, he's back at work, trying to rebuild his life from the ashes. Because of what happened, I've lost an entire side of my family. I don't even remember most of their names anymore. This whole thing taught me that while people say blood is thicker than water, money is thicker than both. My father is the most decent man I've ever known, and he didn't deserve any of the betrayal or suffering his own family brought upon him. Story 35. My mother married my stepfather after knowing him for just 2 weeks. I didn't think much of it growing up, but years later, while snooping around, I discovered why he had really left Florida. He'd been a murder suspect. Hidden beneath his side of the bed were old letters and documents that revealed he was the last person seen with a missing woman whose body was never found. When I once mentioned the missing Florida woman, he cut me off cold, saying, "The picture's in the shoebox. No one will ever find her. That's a fact. Don't touch my things again." I never did. Over a holiday dinner years later, I overheard relatives talking about a man he had stabbed to death with a pool cue. They said that murder was somehow connected to the same missing woman, and that's when he fled to Texas, where he met and married my mom almost immediately. In that same shoebox, I found disturbing letters and photos from his previous stepdaughters. My mother always acted strangely whenever he got mail from them, and now I know why. She suspected he'd had inappropriate relationships with them. She was right. I learned that firsthand. They eventually divorced and remarried other people. My mother still doesn't know what he did to me, and I'll probably never tell her. What good would it do now? Karma has caught up to him anyway. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia years ago, and now, with advanced Alzheimer's, he's a broken shell of the monster he once was. My biological father wasn't much better, a violent alcoholic who beat my mom and once set her recliner on fire while she slept. And even my mother, for all she's endured, isn't innocent. Just a couple of years ago, she attacked a neighbor with a butcher knife. Sometimes I think madness just runs in our bloodline. Story 36. When I was about 10 or 11, my dad spanked me once pretty hard. I don't remember what I did wrong, and it doesn't really matter. What I do remember is that as soon as I started crying, he stopped, left the room silently, and shut the door behind him. A few minutes later, he came back. His eyes were red, his face pale, and I could see he'd been crying too. He knelt down next to me and said he was sorry for hitting me, that he'd never do it again. Then he told me something that stayed with me ever since. He said that when he was a kid, his father was an abusive drunk, and his mother was a gambling addict. He had 3 brothers and a sister, and being the oldest, he was the one who took the worst of it. His father would come home so drunk he could barely stand, looking for someone to hit. My dad said that he often had to take the beatings himself to protect his younger siblings or his mother. Some nights he'd hear his father's boots stomping through the house and know what was coming. The yelling, the crash of something breaking, and then the fists. When his mother gambled away their house, the violence got worse. This cycle went on for years until my dad finally left home at 17. He never said much about what happened after he left, whether his siblings or his mom became the next targets. But I could tell it haunted him. That night, sitting there with me, he said hitting me had made him feel like he'd broken the one promise he made to himself as a kid, that he'd never be like his father. I never forgot the way he looked that night, broken, ashamed, but determined never to repeat that darkness again. And he didn't. He never laid a hand on me after that day. Story 37. The story that still makes my stomach twist is the one about my step-grandmother. Before she entered our family, my grandfather was married to my grandma. They had a good life together, a nice house, a successful business, and 2 kids. Then came the woman who would destroy it all. She convinced my grandfather that the only way they could be together and for him to keep everything was to make my grandmother's life so miserable that she'd leave on her own. That way he'd get the house, the money, and custody of the children. So that's exactly what he did. He beat my grandmother regularly, berated her, and made her feel worthless until she couldn't take it anymore. Eventually she left, thinking it was the only way to survive. He filed for divorce, and because the law was different back then and my grandmother didn't have a lawyer, he kept everything. Just a week after the divorce was finalized, the other woman moved in with her 4 kids. They got married immediately, like vultures picking at the last bones of what was once a family. But the horror didn't stop there. That same year, one of her daughters, the one who became my step-aunt, told her that kids at school said my mom was prettier than she was. That comment sparked something violent in my step-grandmother. One day she cornered my mother and tried to stab her with a pair of massive steel sewing shears. She wanted to get rid of the nuisance, as she called her later. My mom fought back, screaming loud enough that my uncle heard and rushed in. He tore the scissors out of the woman's hands before she could finish what she started. After that, my mom and uncle left the house for good and went to live with their mother, my grandma, who took them in despite having nothing left. I only found out about this years later, when I was a teenager. One Christmas, I refused to go to lunch at my step-grandmother's house. I hated how openly racist they were toward me because I'm part Maori. My mom lost her temper and shouted that she didn't like being in the house of the woman who tried to kill me either. But that's the sha we do, because we're family. At first I didn't believe her. It sounded too extreme, too awful to be real. But when I asked my uncle about it, he just looked at me for a long time before quietly saying, "She's telling the truth."